everyone for coming. Your attendance to these events and purchases of books are what let us keep having them, and we're really excited to see you here today. This evening, we have the honor of hearing from Elizabeth Hilborn about her new book, Restoring Eden, with Mari Trosclair. Elizabeth Hilborn, DVM, is a veterinarian who specializes in honeybee medicine, an avid gardener and fruit grower. For decades, she's fed family and friends with fresh produce from her family's farm in central North Carolina. Mari Trosclair, GRI, ABR, and Master Gardener, is a champion of sustainable agriculture and building. She has helped clients find rural or urban property for organic vegetable and flower farms, pasture land for animals, horse farms, and forest land. Thank you again. Remember, you can grab a copy of Restoring Eden up at the front if you have not already. Turn it over to y'all.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's great to see everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Want to talk a little bit, just orient you to myself. Honeybee veterinarian is my specialty. I just started my clinical practice in 2017, just months before this event changed my life. So it's very ironic. I started my career as a registered nurse, and I became a nurse to work my way through school towards my veterinary degree, but I just loved the career so much because I got to help women birth their babies, and it was just the greatest privilege to have that. And now I'm an environmental health scientist, so I pulled together the human medicine and veterinary medicine, and I am able to study environmental health and help protect the health of so many more people than I could have individually in clinical practice in either of those careers. And now I'm a writer, and if you had asked me 7 years ago, so when are you going to write a book? I'm sorry, are you crazy? My life is so full. There's no way I'll write a book. But this event pushed me into it. I had to.
Thank you for coming this evening and making time to hear Elizabeth. I'm Mari Trosclair. I'm a realtor. I help buyers and sellers in Orange, Chatham, and Durham counties. I also work with developers and HOAs trying to educate and encourage them about the buyer demand for sustainable, biodiverse neighborhoods, limited use of pesticides and herbicides in their developments, allowing backyard chickens, and gardens all throughout the house, all around the house, and throughout the house. In addition, I've tried to connect new farmers, which are usually young farmers, new farmers with retiring farmers or large acreage property owners who want to keep their property in production but don't want to do the work themselves. I am a master gardener and have been for years. I've taken a lot of classes at the Sustainable Ag program in Pittsburgh, which is really great, by the way. Volunteered on local farms, and right now I'm in the midst of learning how to advocate for food systems in our area, and I'll tell you, I have a lot to learn. I do garden, and like most of you, I love to eat good food.
I agree with you, Mari. It is so complex. I've been growing fruit for over 30 years, and I still learn every day. It's one of those avocations, I guess, where it's just lifelong learning. The fruit, the animals, they teach me something new every year.
Yeah.
I have to keep records because that's how I learn. There's things that are so surprising.
And because you're a scientist.
But yeah, food is great. We live out in the country in central North Carolina on acreage, and both my husband and I, we grew up in suburbia, but we always really wanted to live in rural areas. We got tastes of it as teenagers. And those are such formative years. We loved the outdoor work. We loved working with the plants, the animals. My husband's more of he does the machines, the electronics. So we're a nice complementary team. And but as I mentioned, my interest for so many years has been growing food, and the cycle of food production, harvesting, cooking the food, sharing it with family, friends, the community. We don't have a commercial farm, but we're feeding ourselves, I guess about 60% of our fruits and vegetables from our little area, fenced against deer, of course, central North Carolina. And we're just entering now the season where September is like fruit central. Everything's coming ripe, including the persimmons you see on the right there, a North Carolina favorite. So we live near a major river, and it's a river that fluctuates in response to rainfall. So late winter, early spring, sometimes we'll get heavy rains, summertime, tropical storms, and the river will flood. It will spread out into the floodplain. This normally occurs once or twice a year. It's not a big deal until 2017, and you can see on the right-hand side, there's a little inset of a flooded river, and that was the flood that started it all. And I had no idea when I took this picture. It was just, I needed a picture of the flood. I had no idea I'd ever be using this photograph again. I'm going to do a little reading. I'd planned a full Saturday that day in early May. I wanted to check on the young trees I'd recently planted along the river. After breakfast and farm chores, I grabbed 2 buckets from the shed and filled them with pruners, tree stakes, gloves, a spade, and a large water bottle. Just before noon, I hiked downhill. The flood had receded the previous week, but signs persisted in the floodplain meadow. Gray silt coated the grass, and while no one had been looking, the 3-foot-high sand dunes along the Eden River had been rearranged. Twigs, splintered shards of red solo cups, brightly colored mylar balloon husks, and lengths of straw were intertwined among tree branches 4.5 feet above my head. The height of the trash caught in the branches wove a reliable mark of the maximum depth of the water. The recent event had been a major flood. Distorted plastic bottles and Lance cracker wrappers obscured sections of water-flattened grass at my feet. The river had collected and the flood redistributed the buoyant detritus of the watershed into the floodplain below, like children's jacks thrown across a waxed wooden floor. By late afternoon, I'd finished my work and emptied the water bottle. I counted my tools and stooped to pick up as much of the plastic trash as fit into my buckets. I walked across the meadow towards the hill heading home. The musk of the river followed me as I left the dunes behind. I changed direction to visit the swale. The swale is a 2-foot deep, 8-foot wide ditch. It fills periodically with rain or floodwater. When full, it forms a linear wetland almost half a mile long. That afternoon, I sought a section of the brimming swale that glistened in golden light cast over the eastern portion of the meadow. From my years of experience, I knew that sunlit water would provide the best view. The swale in springtime was well known to me. It was one of my favorite places near the farm to watch wildlife. When all is still, tadpoles emerge up into the water column. Some float to the surface and gulp air. Some linger, graze algae, and eat plant debris. Some turn and chase each other in a frenzied game of tag. I anticipated my visit to the natural aquarium with pleasure. As I approached the sunlit pools, I looked for dragonflies in the air, water striders skimming the surface, diving beetles rising and falling in the water column, and I listened for frogs as they splashed to safety. I approached cautiously and didn't hear a single frog. As I neared the swale, I leaned over to view tadpoles in the sunny spot, but the sight before me froze me in place. I didn't see dragonflies in the air. I didn't see water striders on the surface. I didn't see diving beetles moving up and down as they hunted. I didn't see any tadpoles. I was greeted by something I'd never seen before. Still, murky, golden brown water. Portions of the surface were clouded by a thin gray scum. I found a few animals, still and lifeless. 2 were splayed out on the sticky film. 1 lay beside the water. I recognized them. A yellow and black millipede, a green and black dragonfly, and a black with yellow hoverfly. My eyes scanned a wider and wider area of the pool, but there was no movement, no life. The ribbon of still golden brown water lay before me. Plant leaves stirred slightly in the warm air, but the surface of the water was smooth. Gray scum divided the living from the dead. Nothing in the water needed to break the surface for an urgent breath of air. I pivoted in place to look up and down the swale pool, but just saw more stillness, more death.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, I was shocked. I actually dropped my buckets when I saw that because my body just froze. I'm used to seeing such a vibrant community of life in the wetland, because the wetland, when the swale fills, it brings life to the floodplain. The amphibians come and breed there because it's a fish-free place to breed. So they're very successful, the frogs and salamanders, and yeah, it was shocking.
And since you do water work, had you ever seen this anywhere else?
I don't do a lot of field work, so no. I've seen polluted water before, but the gray scum was definitely new. I'd never seen that before, and it shocked me so much that once I gathered my stuff together, I ran up the hill and told my husband about it. I said, was there a industrial accident in the river? Like, what happened? What could have happened? He didn't know. And it was getting dark by that point, and I said, well, please come and look at it. I don't trust my own eyes. I don't trust what I'm seeing. So the next morning we went down there and we walked the entire length of the swale, and there were areas with more or less scum, but there was no normal life at all. And he verified, something is really wrong. Thank goodness I had the presence of mind to collect water samples that day.
What was the result from the water sample tests?
So that's what I had to figure out. You can't just take surface water and carry it to a chemist and say, please tell me what's in this water, because there's all kinds of things in the water. Surface water is a mixture of everything that runs over the land, from natural processes like leaves breaking down, all the way to all the stuff we dump on the land, oil and fertilizer from the farmer upstream. Who knows what's in it? So my job, after collecting the samples, was to start an investigation and find out what could have killed the insects, driven away or killed the frogs. I didn't know if they were dead, they were just gone. So I suspected some sort of chemical, but I had no idea what to do. But I reached out to neighbors and the farmer upstream, friends. I'm sure some of you might have gotten a call, but I was just picking people's brains, trying to figure out, have you ever seen anything like this? What could do this? And yeah, so that started my investigation. And it didn't stop there, unfortunately. Within weeks, we live in a very wildlife-rich area, or it was very wildlife-rich. I would turn on the light to go out and check on the livestock before bed, and when I'd come back, the porch light would have attracted just hundreds of moths. They'd cover the whole side of the wall, and most of them were the gray and brown, kind of unremarkable small moths, but there were these beautiful black and white giant leopard moths, and the green Luna moths, and pink and yellow rosy maple moths. I mean, I would stop and just look at them. They were so beautiful. But within weeks, I saw them dwindle. And one night I was coming back, there were only a few moths around the light, and I actually called my husband out. I said, look at this, like, are you seeing this? And we were just, within days after that, there was nothing. No gnats in the air, no moths at all. And normally at the farm, we would have eastern phoebes, such as this one here, nesting in the open side of the tractor barn and the rafters. And there'd be a dozen or so of them with their nests, very active. This year in 2017, they'd already raised a brood. And those babies had fledged and gone out into the world, bumbling along till they can master flight. And the phoebes had laid their second clutch of eggs, and those had hatched. And the mothers were actively feeding them. And then I noticed that the mothers just went away. The nests were abandoned. The babies had not fledged. And I noticed the chimney swifts disappeared from the sky. And then the dragonflies and other insects, our flying insects, were gone. And the bats disappeared from the sky. The frogs were gone. And what emerged out of the wetland were hordes of mosquitoes. I've never seen anything like this. They rose up out of the floodplain, covered the uplands. We couldn't leave the house without being attacked. We're not used to this at all. We were used to sitting outside watching sunsets without insect repellent on. So this was really different. The dogs, we'd let them out, they'd run back inside. Like we were being attacked. So that was a big change.
Why do you think that mosquitoes weren't killed?
That was one of my biggest questions. So as a scientist, part of my investigation was just deep dive into the scientific literature, into the popular literature, because I talked with the farmer and he had just told me about his normal field prep. He burned all the plants and the soil down with Roundup in preparation for planting. Then he planted the corn seed, he injected nitrogen. I was like, was there anything else? Nope, nothing else. It's like Roundup and nitrogen, what? Like, how could all these animals be dead from Roundup and nitrogen? It made no sense. Because, nitrogen can kill animals, but the corn plants would have been affected with that much nitrogen. So, I was reading and studying and going deep, and nothing made sense. And I was trying to figure out the mosquitoes, and it took probably a couple years after this event happened before I found someone's paper that might have explained it. So I think I was able to tie up all the loose ends in the book, except for maybe one. Maybe there was a turtle mystery that remains, but but I did discover, because I never paid much attention to insects before this, I did discover how much I needed them. Having them go away was a big shock. And I learned that 95% of insects are helping insects. They're predators, they help make our soil, they break our compost down, they are pollinators, and they're food for so many other animals, not just the bats and the frogs that disappeared, but also foxes and coyote and bears. Almost everything eat insects.
And it isn't just you. Just 2 days ago on the Triangle Gardeners listserv in Facebook, somebody was saying, what's wrong with my cucumber? And the end was all twisted and everyone said, it just didn't get pollinated. You have these really misshapen fruit, or no fruit.
Right. They're either gone or they're funky looking. And that's what happened to me that July. I went out in the garden and I had I was picking blueberries, and then I went to the vegetable garden to get that fruit. And I went to the cucumbers, and normally there were so many cucumbers. I had armloads of them, I was giving them away to everybody. I think you might have remembered that year,
Yes.
Mary.
A lot of pickles.
But So I noticed the cucumbers, there were a few of them, and they were just kind of rudimentary, little rat tail twist on them. I'm like, what is this? This makes no sense at all. So I went inside again, trying to research, like, what is this cucumber? Lack of pollination. So that summer, the vegetables did poorly. I had very poor yields. And then for the years that followed, we had no blueberries, no apples, no pears. So our pollinators really took a hit. And after, like, as I was processing this experience, I think if this had just been my farm, I never would have written a book. I mean, it would have been sad that this happened, but it wouldn't have a more general relevance. But I learned that it wasn't just our wetland, it wasn't just our farm, that this is happening everywhere. In 2019, a report was published about the decline of insects globally, a loss of 41% in just a decade. And the insects that were most affected were the water insects and pollinators of the groups of insects. In 2018, the New York Times came out with a magazine feature called The Insect Apocalypse is Here. And so I was hearing this from elsewhere. I was like, wow, like, what is this? We lost almost 3 billion birds over 50 years. And the insect loss, the bird loss, the loss of biodiversity, I find was associated with big changes in agriculture over the last 20 years. Because I spoke to my neighbors about this, they had no idea that modern crop production could be associated with this kind of damage. And I explained to them that I had learned after this event that we used to have a model where insecticides would be applied to crops when there was an insect problem. And starting in the early 90s, and you can see the graph, kind of the exponential increase in use. Starting in the mid-90s, we've gone to a model where insecticide is applied to crops almost every time, whether it's needed or not. And these are very potent insecticides. A paper came out recently that shows almost a 50 times greater toxicity of soil to insects in just the years between 92 and 2014. You may notice 2014, that's when there's graph stops as well. Look at the maps below. There's a heat map that shows brown areas of pesticide use, and then another map beside it that's almost white. That's the 2014 map, shows the pesticide use. The white map is 2015. They stopped reporting this use. So these chemicals are now the largest group of insecticides in the world are these chemicals. They're used in every continent except for Antarctica. And in the United States, they're not, the largest use is not being tracked anymore. So we lost that ability. So now I see fields of corn, and I used to get feelings like this is food security.
Yeah, it's complete. Your book has completely changed how I feel when I look at a field of corn. And the first thing I do is look at the slope of the land and where I think the runoff is going to go. And if it's going into a creek, if it's going into a pond, it's a little upsetting.
One different thing about these insecticides is that they're water soluble. Mm-hmm. So they do run off fields. Very little is taken up by the crop plant, and most of it goes into the soil and water. They vary. It's a large group of insecticides, but the one that contaminated our land had a half-life of over 3 years, was the potential maximum half-life. Now, I don't know the half-life in our land, because studies show the type of soil, the temperature, the pH, the organic content of soil, all that really matters for how long the insecticides persist, but they can persist a long time. They can leach down into the groundwater. People have found them in shallow wells and now increasingly deep wells. And they're systemic. So any plant that takes up that contaminated water, the whole plant becomes contaminated with the insecticide. So insects that feed on the nectar and pollen also become contaminated, or other insects that are feeding on the plant, like leafcutter bees, making pieces of leaf to support their young, will bring the contamination to the nest. And I learned that the insecticide is exceptionally potent, which is, for business, it's a great feature because you need less mass, less amount of pesticide. 1 milligram can coat a corn seed, and that's enough to kill 80,000 honeybees. And a cornfield starts with about 30,000 seeds. So when I was learning about this, I was like, oh, now I have to write about it because I wasn't aware of it. I'm an environmental scientist. I had no idea because it's largely hidden now.
I have to comment here too. About that time, it was so hard to watch because your despair was just so apparent, and it was like it was difficult to put one foot in front of the other, and you just felt compelled to get this word out.
Once I learned what it was, I did feel like I had to tell people, especially people who needed to use the water that ran off of these fields.
And the poor farmers handling this.
Yeah. Well, luckily, I mean, it was made, one of the appeals of these insecticides were they're less toxic to people than some of the older types of pesticides, insecticides we used to use. But even I'm finding now that assumption is in question now that we're finding mammalian health effects associated with these chemicals. But I want to talk a little bit about what gives us our food, because to me this was the bottom line. I saw my pollinators disappear, and we lost our fruit production, our vegetable production, a lot of it, because we had no pollinators. But the animals that are affected by these insecticides also make our soil. So up on the hill where we didn't have the flood contamination, our soil was full of organic matter and fluffy and black, but down in the floodplain, there was no life. There were no earthworms, there were no beetles, and the soil was thick and flaccid like a pudding almost. It was very difficult to see. So I'd never lifted my eyes beyond my own garden before, but I realized that the soil's a finite resource and that we can harm it with our actions.
Well, a lot of your animals, as you call them, they break down all of the, I mean, any of us who garden here, you put your mulch down and it just goes away in like one season. But you were having the debris that just didn't break down because the animals weren't there to do their work.
Yeah, that's right. We had some wheat straw that had flowed with the flood off the farmer's field into our floodplain, and it was there for almost 5 years without breaking down. It just sat there because there were no animals to break it down. Yeah, it was. So the other thing this really woke me up to, because I was going deep into the agricultural literature, environment, soils, I realized that our farmers are really at risk from this paradigm because it does harm the soil. It harms the fertility of the resource that they use to make a living. Soil fertility is directly associated with yield. And farmers are under unprecedented pressure right now. Farm debt is similar to what it was in the early 80s. So this is due to very high input costs. AgWeb was predicting that input costs for an acre of corn in 2023 would be about $1,000 an acre. Seed, pesticides, fertilizer. And then the other burden, of course, is the land costs, and loans are higher now too. So I just really feel for farmers because they don't make a lot of money.
Right.
USDA was showing in 2021 the median income from farming was $210. So most farmers need an outside income to farm.
So this makes this a really expensive, difficult hobby.
Yeah, it's a labor of love, literally. So I think this experience has also made me a farmer advocate. And I spoke with farmers, a lot of farmers, and I see cornfields differently now. And I'm going to read a little more. So I spoke with Jonathan Lundgren. He's a scientist and an insect specialist or entomologist. He lives in South Dakota. He runs Blue Dasher Farm as a working demonstration farm, and he uses the farm to show that producing food and conserving agricultural land are not mutually exclusive. He told me, what led me down this road was there was a group of farmers I'd met that were growing conventional crops and were doing so in the absence of any pest management. It flew in the face of everything I understood. What they taught me was, in fact, pests are not inevitable. You can design a system where pests are not a problem to begin with. What it requires is thinking about food production completely differently than we have in the past. It's easy to focus on problems, he said, but there's a whole lot of hope right now. And prior to understanding regenerative agriculture, I didn't have a whole lot of hope. That's a really important message that people need to take home. There's something we can do. If we invest in low pesticide methods, like regenerative agriculture, we're going to come out just fine. So Dr. Lundgren's not the only one who is working for a sea change in how we grow food in this country. There are organic farmers, agroecologists, people who go beyond organic. You know much more about this than I do, Mary, with the array of approaches.
Well, and we're lucky to live in this area where there are so many, and actually not just this area, this state, there are so many wonderful programs like the Center for Environmental Farming Systems. I think their main farm is in Goldsboro. Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, the fabulous Sustainable Ag program in Pittsboro at the community college. We have some wonderful native nurseries right here in the area. We're going to give Rachel a plug in Pittsboro. And so many community gardens so that people, no matter what their socioeconomic group is, and I'd like to see more developments with a farm as their centerpiece rather than a golf course, but you know, that's another topic.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the regenerative farming, agroecology, low pesticide methods aren't really tracked by the USDA. We don't have good numbers. What we have data on are organic farms, because certified organic farms, the USDA keeps those data and reports it. So USDA did a 2019 organic survey, and found that a higher percentage of organic farmers are young farmers. A higher percentage of new farmers report farming organically, and a larger percentage of organic farmers report farming as their primary occupation. They're making a living farming. And that's good news indeed for our future food security. Younger people are getting involved in producing food in a way that they can keep producing that food for decades to come. There's hope for our children and grandchildren for a secure food future. So farming's becoming a viable career choice for many, and farms are becoming a healthy place to raise children. And this whole experience has left me with a better understanding of where I am in this world. And where I am is I am a human being surrounded by a community of life. I am not separate. I am part of that fabric. And I think now of the community of life like a beautiful woven cloth where each thread represents a life, and each life contributes to the whole. And I've learned that if we remove too many threads, the cloth frays and we will fall. And thank you so much for coming out with your attention.
Thank you.
I'd love to take questions. We would. Oh, yes.
Kim Barajic.
Hi, Kim.
So did the farmer ever use Monsanto corn seeds again?
I don't know the manufacturer of the seeds, but he's continuing to farm how it's conventional farming. That's how most people farm.
But that's the seeds that are covered with
Most, over 90% of corn seeds sold in the United States, 90% of corn fields are the coated seed.
Yeah. So doesn't this just keep happening?
Right now, it's the way of doing business.
Have you heard of the documentary Big Little Farm?
Mm-hmm.
That's the most wonderful story.
Thank you.
I would just like to say that in North Carolina, 94% of land is privately owned. So whether you have a balcony, you have a quarter acre, you have 40 acres, you have 100 acres, there's something everybody can do. That makes a big difference.
Yeah, planting flowering plants is huge. Most insects, birds eat the seeds. Flowering plants are really a big contribution, even some in a pot on a balcony, all the way to leaving a wild corner.
I had a question about, I didn't know that there were systemic insecticides. I knew about, well, I guess I did, systemic pesticides. I've always wondered though, if that gets transferred to the seed of the plant. You know, when the plant reproduces, is that pesticide, insecticide part of the DNA of that offspring?
So I'm not exactly sure about persistence in seeds. What I do know is that if you plant a systemically treated woody plant, the systemic insecticide can be active for years in the woody plant. In the food plants that are treated, I know that all of the plant, the fruit, the portions that we eat, like asparagus, as a shoot, are all include residues of that insecticide. And I don't know about seed, but I buy a lot of seed from Johnny's Select Seeds in Maine, and they do advise buying organic seed if you're growing organically. So maybe they do, I don't know that. Yeah.
So I've lived on the same 38 years, lived on the same 20 acres. So I know what's going on. I know that we're not downhill from anything, so we get no runoff. And I've noticed this year a distinct lack of bees. Is that just normal cyclical, because I have not kept written records, or is that
What kind of bees?
bees?
Like
All
native bees or honeybees?
We have we don't have honeybees, we don't keep honeybees, but we have a barn and we have piles of stuff, and lots of woods, and a few years ago, we had a lot of yellow jacket nests in the ground that comes and goes, I guess. But, you know, we have the bees that bore into the rafters in the sheds, and we have the bees that are out pollinating the different things. And this year, when I sit in the yard and look at the clover that's blooming, I see no bees.
So there definitely are cycles, and we're getting some crazy weather. So we had a late freeze this year.
Right.
And I noticed the same thing. I saw a few queens, bumblebees are really obvious. I saw a few queens this year and then nothing. What happened? Was the weather so extreme? And I had almost no apples or pears this
Yeah,
year.
We don't have that either. And we had no mud dollars, 0 mud dollars, which
And-
is strange.
But I drive out of my little area where they also had the freeze, and the apple trees were full of apples. Now I've had a little, you know, I mentioned that there were years with no apples or pears, so we've had a rough recovery. We still haven't recovered 6 years later, and I'm hoping we'll get to the former biodiversity, but who knows what will happen. But it didn't come back in a linear manner, so I think maybe we're getting in-migration of insects and then they can't survive for some reason, but I can't comment, you know. I think this is one of the reasons that it's so hard to really understand what's happening with the insects, is it takes dedicated study of the same site over time. Hallman wrote a great paper from nature reserves in Germany, and he studied flying insects over the years at these specific sites and found a large increase in decrease in just 20 years. And I can't remember the percentage now, I don't have it written down with me, but it was shocking because it was a nature reserve, it wasn't an agricultural field. So we are having insect loss, and it's hard to say exactly why, but I will say the stressors are the intense weather changes we're having, which disrupt life cycles, and the plants bloom at the wrong time for the animals, so that's a problem. And we're also seeing more diseases, especially with bees. You know, the honeybee diseases spread to the natives and put extra pressure on them. But then on top of that, we have these really potent water-soluble systemic insecticides that are widely used. People are using them for lawn care, fruit and vegetable growers use them. They're used in nurseries. So if you go buy pollinator plants for your yard, please ask if they're pesticide-free, because if they're not, you're bringing home potentially a systemic treated pollinator plant, and when the insects feed on that plant, they can become intoxicated. These exposures are cumulative. So if they're exposed once and survive, then they're exposed again, the likelihood of death goes up each time. And even lower exposures disrupt their ability to reproduce. So we're kind of like, the odds are stacked against insects right now. We are not doing a good job of protecting another resource we need to grow food.
Farmers themselves are at risk. Are they experiencing any, year after year handling these products, any significant health downfalls or
So
effects?
I have read some about this. There are agricultural health studies that have been conducted and found that some cancers are more likely among farmers, and you know, people have been exposed to mixtures of pesticides during farming for a very long time. So there's very little human health information about this new class of pesticides, but we do know we're exposed. the CDC does surveys of people, National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and they've been doing them every year for decades. And a recent report of results of that survey shows about 50% of us have evidence of these group of chemicals exposure in our urine. And then a recent study out of Europe, it was Switzerland, talked about a clinic where children were having spinal fluid taken for therapeutic purposes, and they got an extra sample to test for their study. 100% of children had evidence of exposure to these insecticides. So they're used worldwide commonly. They're so very effective at making perfect fruit and vegetables for the market. And now with the crops being treated every time they're grown, they've become very common.
And I would think migrant workers would be super exposed because they keep going from area to area and being exposed over and over and over again in the same season.
That's a long answer to a short
Oh.
question. Yes.
I have a thought about this gentleman's situation. In addition to farmers, Duke Energy sprays Roundup under all its power lines, and we're not terribly far from that. So we notice, we're near us, they spray maybe every third year, fourth year. And if you're near power lines that have gotten sprayed, I think you would notice a difference.
Yeah, and the power line comes across our property just to our house, so they don't ever bother to spray it because we won't live on the property. But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, so, I mean, it is ubiquitous, so.
You get so excited now when you're driving at night and you get home and there are like bug splats on the car because you go, oh, they're coming back.
I'm not the only one that's excited.
I don't get out much.
Yeah, I do notice when I go to areas like go visit up in the mountains, there are a lot more insects. Then I come back down into where there's more farming and there are fewer, but that's just, driving my observation. Also, I'm looking for it now. After this experience, my perception is so colored by what I've gone through.
So how has your population of lightning bugs been this year?
We had some. It's not like it used to be, but we had some, so I was really happy. And we had some butterflies back for the first time this year. So I'm just thrilled to see butterflies. I love them, and they're so conspicuous and colorful. And yeah. What about you? How are your fireflies this year?
Lower
Oh,
than normal. I mean,
sorry.
we still have them, but it's not, a giant riot. You see them.
Yeah. They're so precious.
Right. We are still seeing butterflies. But I'm sure that it's airborne, mostly, what's occurring to us. But we're not right up against Duke Forest, but we're surrounded by a good bit of Duke Forest between the Durham and Orange County line. There's a lot of Duke Forest. And we don't have neighborhoods with HOAs around us, so I don't know what individuals are doing in their yard, but it's not like a development that has rules about what you can and can't do. So it's just been interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Hope it's better next year.
Plant
But
flowers.
I will agree, we've noticed that the trees on our property have stressed, a lot of the trees have died because of weather events and drought and cold and things like that, and certain species especially. But we also have an ephemeral pond on part of the property which covers about an acre when it's flooded. And
Wow.
we have continued to have a healthy frog population.
Oh, that's
So
wonderful.
that makes me hope that at least down there are insects.
That's a really good sign if the frogs can survive because they're so sensitive to pollution. You had mentioned the bees drilling in your rafters, and I want to shout out for Eastern carpenter bees. So I value these bees so much now. They were the last to fall, and the first to come back. And when I was like pushing my head against a wall trying to plant a garden even without pollinators, they gave us cucumbers in the absence of any other pollinator. So I am so grateful for Eastern carpenter bees, and we let them drill away because just like, thank you for being here.
They only drill salt.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thanks you all for
Thank
coming
you
out.
all for coming out. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mary. Do you have it turn off here, or you already?
No, I do.
Hear me? The light went to red. I was wondering.
Yeah,
Did you hear me?
fine.
Yeah, I was trying to look at everybody in the audience. Oh, hi, Kim. Good to see you. I'm well. It's been too long.
Every once in a while, our trip to Tucson comes up in my photo feed.
Oh,
You know?
okay. It's so much
It was
fun.
fun.
What a great experience for me, you know?
Yeah. I'll tell you though, once I realized, once it really hit me, how,